This is Mai Kue, and you are listening to The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. This is a podcast that is dedicated to stories and tellings of my spiritual experiences. Some of the stories I will be sharing will cover many topics such as the parallels in spirituality and mental health, ghost stories, dreams, tarot reading, mediumship, and more. I do want to provide a disclaimer that these are all just based on my personal experiences. I do not have any certification in spiritual healing or mental health therapy, nor do I have an altar to practice Hmong shamanistic healing or rituals. Many of the stories I will be sharing are based purely on my personal experiences and how I have made sense of them throughout the years. So to those who are listening to this podcast, I hope that you will enjoy my stories and join me on the narrow path in the floating mountains.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel right. I never meant to make you cry, you were right. Just leave me be, I'm not gonna put up a fight.
In this episode, I answer the question, do you have the gift? When I say the gift, I am specifically talking about spiritual gifts. So this episode was actually inspired by some of the people who have met me and discovered that I do tarot readings. They're curious if I have the gift of receiving spiritual messages, either through visions or through spiritual messages through dreams or even hearing them. And so I wanted to focus on the answer to this question to open up a conversation on what it means to even have the gift. This question is something that many people also ask themselves, and that maybe by shedding light on it, it can help other people process their personal experiences with spiritual messages, and also just providing another perspective at looking at having spiritual gifts. Also in this episode, I will, of course, share my firsthand experiences as it relates to the topic of the spiritual gifts. I kind of did a little bit of that with the dreams episode. Even when I was trying to figure out how to start off this episode, I actually struggled with it because I had a lot of things to add to even the answer to this very simple question, right? This question asks, like, do you have it or not? Like, just tell me. But I often give people an explanation rather than an answer. And I feel that mostly it's because when people ask me this, I feel that they're also very curious about how they may have it or not. So in a way, it's like very comparative, or they're gathering information about, well, do I have it or do I not have it? And so for them to ask it, I take it as, they're trying to understand their own process. And so I've come to find that a lot about the people who are very curious. They're very open to spirituality, but I feel that they're very conflicted about owning up to it, but also not completely owning up to it, if that makes sense. It's almost like there's a lot of self-doubt. And so when people often ask me this, they're kind of curious, like, okay, how does her gifts work? And what else am I doing that's not right? Or what else am I doing that is right, that can help me to elevate my spiritual gifts? And then sometimes some people, they're just curious because they just want to know. They just find it really fascinating, interesting, and they enjoy talking about spirituality just as much as I do, but they're not interested in possessing some type of ability or skill to connect to the spiritual side. So there is going to be a lot packed into this episode. I do feel that as I talk more and more about the idea of even having access or possessing spiritual gifts, that it's just, again, a lot more complicated than just a yes or no. But to make things easy, I will just answer it right off the bat. And I feel like this is something that I should just, answer right away to people and then explain to them, right? Or maybe some people don't even want to hear about it. They just want to know yes or no. Because again, there's just so much that ties into having spiritual gifts that it's not black or white, right? It's very gray. So anyways, to answer the question of do I have spiritual gifts? To that, I would say yes. And I say yes, that I have the gift, but so do you. Why or how might you think about it, right? Why or how might you practice it is completely up to you. Sometimes it's even more mundane than people think, that it's actually not a very, it's not a very mystifying thing once you realize how much of what you're already doing and how you're receiving signs is already built into your the way that you access communication with others, how you socialize. It's just like that. So for everyone who has gone through the process will probably say the same thing too, about overcoming that self-doubt to accepting the gifts. That they would say a similar thing too, that everyone has these gifts. We already know how to do it. It is just in a matter of how in tune you are to your gifts. For example, everyone can draw, right? Essentially, everyone can draw. Everyone can hold a pen or hold some type of a utensil to make some shape or make some pattern. But it's just in a matter of how fine-tuned your skills are and what you perceive as a refined piece of art. It really is something as simple that it's like trusting your gut and just going with it. And also everybody's style, right? It comes down to also everybody's style of receiving gifts, but also interpreting their signs and symbols that they receive. A part of it is also you believing in yourself that you have it. And I think, again, a lot of people ask themselves this question either because they've been made to believe they aren't capable of it, or that they don't have it, or are gaslighted to feel like they're just making it up, or made to feel weird about it, or there's many reasons why someone might doubt themselves when it comes to having spiritual gifts. But once you believe that you have it, it becomes a lot easier. Another thing too is not comparing your spiritual path with others, not comparing the progress of how you are developing your skills with others. And the same thing goes with art, right? If you are a very creative person, or you are working hard towards creating something, that we're always bound to compare ourselves to someone else. And so when you start comparing yourself to someone else, you start building up that self-doubt. And what can happen is you start not believing in your work. You're not believing in your skills. And so you start comparing in a way where you're like, well, this person's getting really good. They're getting a lot of people who are coming to them asking them for help through their spiritual gifts. But I'm over here struggling, and I just can't seem to get anything right, or I can't seem to help anyone out. And so when you compare yourself to someone else's progress, that also limits you in even believing in what you know. A great way that I have that has helped me to overcome this is that my symbol system is completely different from somebody else's symbol system, and that it's not that their way is better. It's that I'm trying to learn how to develop my symbol system to know how to receive messages faster and quicker, I think in the last episode, I talked about how whenever a person who has passed arrives in my dream with someone who is living, that's often a sign that the person who's living is struggling with something. That might not always be the same for other people who receive messages through their dreams. So I think the one thing that really helps me overcome that self-doubt was just believing in my symbol system and just writing things down and just going back to it. And every time you go back to this like symbol dictionary that you've created, it makes more sense, right? The formula and the equations, they just all have the same results. Then you start believing yourself a little bit more. And so that's something that I learned how to do, just based on even some of the things that I picked up through resources or research, from reading articles about honing your spiritual gifts. There was a really good book that I came across, and how I came across it was I was at a point where I was really struggling to understand like what I was dealing with. I was getting a lot of different things coming in through my dreams, and I was having a lot of anxiety, and I was going through really high highs and really low lows, and just very spiritually vulnerable. I was having a lot of psychic attacks, and I was just feeling like I was hitting a dead end, and I didn't know who else I could ask to help me. I was seeking spiritual healing services, and I think I was having really high expectations for the spiritual healer to give me the answer, to tell me like, yes, you're supposed to practice and this is what you can do. Or I was deeply searching for someone to invite me to be their student. And I felt that for someone to invite me to be their student, that I was finally initiated into this process of becoming someone who could hone in on their spiritual gifts. And so I searched for it like everywhere, through traditional means, through the Hmong culture. I was searching through New Age spirituality. I was like doing readings and just constantly feeling like I was getting a dead end. Like my own validation was not good enough for even me. And so I started taking, actually didn't start, it was a 1-day course where I took a psychic 101 class. And that was where it really changed things for me, because even the act of signing up for the class was like the first step for me to be like, okay, you're owning up to this, do it. Like, this is how you're gonna do it. Like, who cares what anyone else is gonna say, or who cares who is going to validate like what you're doing? You're gonna do this yourself. You're gonna have to do this yourself, because you are tired of waiting for people to validate you. Like, why not just validate yourself? Why not just learn how to do these things yourself? Because you know what you're feeling and everything that you're experiencing is very real. And so I ended up taking that Psychic 101 course, and it really changed everything for me. It wasn't even like a 7-day like spiritual retreat. It was just a 6-hour workshop where she just told me, it was like a class of 6 of us, and it was, she just ran through like general information. It wasn't even like an in-depth course, but just the sheer act of being a part of this workshop and finding out how to tune your gifts was just so amazing and validating in itself, that it completely changed the way I thought about my personal experiences and having spiritual gifts. And so I was at that point where I was just like, you know what, fed up with it. I was just really fed up with it. So I started taking initiative to learn certain things, and in the end, like, it really helped. And it wasn't even anything where, again, I was doing like 7-day spiritual retreats, or I wasn't going to like the Amazons to take like a hallucinogenic, however you say it, herb to get a spiritual trip. It was just the things that I was already doing, learning how to use that and just use it in a way to listen more carefully and pay attention to everything more carefully. After that, everything else was pretty intuitive. Like, I just kind of knew what to do. I just kind of put things together and figured out my process to get to the spiritual messages or the answers that I was looking for. In that process too, and actually what I was originally alluding to was that there was a book that I found. It was an excerpt that I saw on Instagram, an excerpt of a chapter of this book that was about a doctor who burned out and figured out how to still do healing work through the spiritual, and she talked a little bit about her spiritual experiences. And in the book, she has like little worksheets and things in there too to help you do journaling. I really didn't care too much about the journaling part, but the stories that she shared were very profound and experiences that I could truly resonate with, even though they are from very different socioeconomic experiences. However, how she arrived to owning up to her skills and refining them was something that I could relate to. And the title of the book is called Anatomy of a Calling. And I highly recommend that book too. I highly recommend it. She talks about this really amazing experience of calling on the spirit to send her a message by, sending it in the way of, whales visiting her. And she lives on the West Coast. And so as she was kind of at this stop in the Big Sur, she saw a family of whales just breaching the surface of the water, and she took it as a sign. And so for me at that time, things like that were happening. I would ask for a sign, and all of a sudden something unusual would appear that was very specific to what I had asked. And so I had experiences like that, and things just started happening quicker. Things were just being made to appear quicker, to where it helped me to validate the things that I was experiencing, believe in myself a little bit more about the path I was about to take, not even in relation to my spiritual journey, but also to the things that I was dealing with on an emotional and mental health like path. But a lot of that was just kind of working out. So again, going back to it being the greatest hurdle for me to own up to, honoring like my spiritual skills and my spiritual gifts. That's a snippet of what I had to deal with. And again, through many spiritual healers, no matter how many times I asked, they would confirm, but then doubt would also set in. There were also people who were saying, like, in my past life, I was like a healer, and I was hung for it. And validating that. I went through a process of trying to feel validated, or trying to go through a ceremonial process. That's kind of what my expectation was. But I kept getting shut down, or told my experience was just me having a moment, like, oh, you're just thinking too much. And then it, again, came down to me just reflecting and thinking, who's to say I have to take the traditional path? Much of what I learned was to heal myself from my own trauma. And time again, I kept putting myself in a position of being gaslit and being told until I figured out how to channel my gifts. I realized I was very desperate to seek validation in that process. Like, I was just so desperate in seeking validation from a specific group. And I think that's kind of what really set back my process of expediting my process of channeling these skills when I really didn't need it. Like, I didn't need that validation from any specific group. And I think for me, it was mostly like my family and also people in my community, like being very desperate to be validated that, yeah, you have this gift and you're well respected. And maybe it wasn't validation for my spiritual gifts, but validation for respect. And so that was kind of how it paralleled like my actual life versus my spiritual journey, my spiritual validation. So I turned to channeling my gifts through tarot. So after all of this, I realized, like, Mai Kue, you could do this on your own, and you don't need to be validated by people. Just do tarot. Just do it. They're gonna call you crazy anyways. Just do it. So I started doing live tarot readings, and it was very open-ended. And how I do tarot readings is that it was just very intuitive. The cards would open up, I would pick them randomly, open up, and I would just interpret the cards as if they were a storybook without words. I would just interpret it, and it would align or resonate with the person. And then sometimes it didn't either. And I always said that, if it doesn't resonate with you, that's completely fine, and so in an interesting way, when I started validating myself, I became more confident and was able to refine and channel them a lot. Channeling was a lot more clearer. Simultaneously, I was able to make sense of the spiritual a lot more intuitively too. Instead of relying on a mentor, I took the initiative to take the workshops to help me fine-tune and direct my gifts and skills. And then I researched something whenever I was unable to pull an answer, and essentially just trusted the information that resonated with me. Whatever made sense to me, I just trusted it. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's me. That's me, and I'm gonna do that. And so I more so trusted the sources that I was seeking. And if it didn't make sense, then I was just like, okay, this is not for me. And just move on, and I wouldn't try to be stuck on, why am I not getting this right? Like, oh, I missed that point. And there's going to be a lot of disappointments too. For me, there was a lot of disappointments. Like, I would have dreams that were very prophetic, and I wouldn't know how to decipher what my dream was trying to tell me. Like, I would talk about it with my husband, but I wouldn't know how to act on it, right? So something in me was like, Michael, you need to do something, act on it. Something is going to happen. Something that is not good is going to happen. And the intensity of the dreams and the actual cause and effect depended on my emotions and my dreams. So if I woke up from a dream and it felt very, very impactful, and if I woke up and my heart was beating at 100 miles a minute and I was panicking, I knew that something not good was going to happen. And it really wasn't even dreams where it was a nightmare. It would just be a dream that would invoke some type of an emotion or a feeling that just was so unnerving that even in my waking life that I just couldn't shake it. And then it wouldn't even happen the day that I had the dream. It would happen 2 days later. And so for me, it was always like, oh, something's going to happen. And then when it happened and I couldn't prevent it because I didn't know how it was going to unravel, that when it did happen, I would just be so upset. I was really upset with myself, knowing that I had this dream, that this dream was trying to tell me something, and why didn't I prepare more to prevent it? And the cause and effect, the things that would happen were very, very hard to deal with, but not to the point where I lost somebody, or not to the point where someone was critically injured. And by some faith or some form of someone protecting me, that my loved ones who were affected were protected like somehow. And so when it did happen in waking life, it would invoke the same type of fear, and even 10 times more than when I woke up from that dream. And so a lot of people would think that, oh, you thought too much about it and it manifested. I don't think it was a case of it manifesting because I had fear. I think it manifested because it was inevitable, and it was something that I wasn't going to be able to control, and that it was bound to happen anyways. Same like my prophetic examples in the last episode where I talked about the massacres. It was something that I just could not prevent, and it was bound to happen anyways. And so I think we're made to feel aware of it because we are meant to experience these things as a collective on a larger scale. For me, I was meant to experience the things that I experienced because it would then teach me something about this situation that had unfurled, and how to prepare in future situations. I think there's a lot of karmic cords connected when things like that happen too. And I could go into karmic cords in a whole different episode. But in a way, I was meant to experience them to know, like, hey, you can receive these messages. Now you know, like, that you can receive these messages. How do you anticipate these things when it happens? Or how do you anticipate, how do you just anticipate these things when it happens, right? And so I ended up again just working through all of the things that I was working on, and accepted myself and the path I was carving for myself, and not being limited to one thing. And things just became clear, even if I had to experience it the hard way, that it was going to be something that I needed to deal with. I think it's similar also to what some people say about shamans, that there's going to be times where you're not going to be able to execute like your healing or your what do they call it, your missions, right? You're not going to be able to execute your missions as accurately as you can, and to just be prepared to know how to deal with them. And I've heard people say that when shamans practice too, that when they mess up, that they just have to take the blows and learn how to prevent it in the future, or learn how to approach a similar situation in the future. So again, I'm not trying to align my path with that of being a shaman, but I feel that there's a lot of knowledge in some of the things that we already know about shamanism and being a practicing Hmong shaman that is also pretty relatable to even our own experiences as people who are just trying to navigate like a path of healing from trauma, generational trauma, ancestral trauma, past life trauma, and figuring out how to access healing in that aspect through the spiritual. So I was, again, going back to, where my state of mind was before I finally started accepting my spiritual gifts. I was always hoping for someone to tell me that I have spiritual gifts. And, when all along, like, I knew my spiritual experiences were real and that I did have them. And I realized this and started finding my own answers and building my own practice. I said that I started doing tarot readings, and then I did that for a few, it wasn't that long, like maybe 2 or 3 months, and then I stopped doing it because it started becoming overwhelming. And then I started to just think about answering the question instead of do I have the gift. I started reframing the question to I have these gifts, but what do I want to do with them? And how can I make them more clear and receive messages more directly? And so simultaneously too, in an ironic way, validating my spiritual experiences was also helping me cope with validating what I experienced growing up. And when I did start owning up to my gifts, there was so much self-doubt I had to work through, that eventually when I started again just validating my own personal experiences and my own trauma, that things just kind of worked hand in hand with each other. I started seeing it as like, why do I keep looking for validation from other people to tell me like what I experienced was real, right? Similar to my spiritual experiences, but also with my trauma. I was trying to seek validation through the trauma that I had experienced, and it almost seemed like it was invisible because it was a very isolated experience. It was a very isolated trauma, and not a lot of people knew about it. So I couldn't talk about it to anyone close to me. And yet I was dealing with depression as a middle schooler all the way through until I had my son. I was dealing with depression, and I just really didn't know how to process it. And then when I started my spiritual journey in 2015, that was when things started kind of unfurling in a way where I started knowing how to direct my frustration, and knowing how to of course like unpack my trauma and know how to talk about it. I think it was through the spiritual that I started knowing how to talk about my trauma too. Even prior to being on my spiritual journey, I had attended like support groups, focus groups, and just even being like a person who was a guest speaker to a workshop and leading a workshop, I still didn't know how to unpack like my own trauma because I kept getting re-triggered. And so when I finally started my spiritual journey, that it started becoming easier to validate my own experiences, because in the same way I was having spiritual experiences that no one could. It was also very isolated, right? Like I was having these dreams, only I could see these dreams, and yet I was still seeking validation from someone who didn't see it or experience it with me. And so it was one of those things of like seeking validation from people who could resonate, or hoping that they would see me. And so through this process of just being like, you know what, screw it, just do your own thing, just start doing things that like are working for you, that it helped me to work through a lot of my trauma that just was holding me back. So again, when I did start doing the spiritual courses and stuff, that was when like it really changed for me. I think I wanted to take this episode to just kind of talk about my thought process, and I think at the core of this episode it's about validation, seeking validation for your spiritual experiences. And something that I learned from this is that if you're having them and you know that you're having them and you're just wondering if you have spiritual gifts, then take this as a sign that you do. Everyone does. Everyone has spiritual gifts. It's just a matter of how in tune you are with your gifts. and how you are channeling them, that they become clear. It's in a matter of how, I guess, like, in talking about it, it's not about like, do you have these gifts? It's about how can I make them more clear? How can I channel them more clear? Because you're getting, like, you're consistently getting these messages, but you're talking to the wrong people who are telling you, like, no, you don't. And that was something that I grew up with. People told me, like, no, you don't. Like, you're being crazy, or you're being stupid, or, you're just thinking too much. And, or, the one that is the most frequent one is like, oh, it's nothing. It's nothing. Like, it didn't happen, right? And so for you, it really happened because you can remember it like a memory. But at the core of it, I kind of, in my personal experience, came out of it thinking, like, why am I asking other people if I did experience this or not, right? When you obviously experienced it because you're talking about it. And so I hope that just by listening to what I share, that it sheds some light onto even your personal experiences with receiving spiritual signs or spiritual messages. I thought a lot about whether I wanted to talk about the different types of spiritual gifts too, but I think I'm going to save that for another episode. But that is pretty much all that I have to share for the answer to the question of, do you have the gift? I would say yes. Even if you are someone who is asking yourself this, believe it, because there's a reason why you're asking yourself this question. Like, if you're seeing ghosts and things, like, yeah, like, some people even say that some people are very sensitive, and I don't know how to explain it in English because we have a word for it in Hmong. It's almost like the same thing as saying someone's spiritual door is very thin or is very open, or they are able to see through the veil very easily. Some people can do that. I, for one, am not that way. I just feel things. I don't really see things, but more than often, what I feel is very, very, very on point. But again, if you're asking yourself these questions, try asking yourself, okay, now that I own up to, now thinking about it, when you catch yourself asking yourself, do I have the gift, spiritual gifts? Why not ask yourself, okay, I have these spiritual gifts. How do I make it so that I can receive them more clear, or so that it's more consistent, so I'm not guessing so much, right? Because you want to refine it. It's like, okay, I know how to draw a circle. How can I draw a person? Going back to like the drawing example. And I'm using the drawing example because I think just naturally that's like something that I do, and something that I hear people tell me a lot, like, oh wow, like, you can draw, like, I can't draw. I'm like, sure, you can draw a circle. And then they start saying, oh, but I can only draw stick people. I'm like, well, that's where I started, just stick people, and I just kept drawing and drawing and drawing until like I got to a point where I'm satisfied with it. But even when I'm satisfied with it, I want to keep refining it. So you can still be satisfied with knowing, like, okay, I have spiritual gifts, but it all comes down to like how much more you want to refine it. And again, if this is something that you've always questioned yourself, like, why not just jump heading into it? Something that I tell people is like, if you're having a lot of spiritual like messages coming through, why not just take a Psychic 101 course? The course that I took, the workshop that I took, was only $60 for like 6 hours, and we just ran through the basic information, but I just took back so much from it that it has, again, it was so beginner level in hindsight thinking about it now, but it has changed my life in terms of my perception about the experiences that I was having. So if you were to ask me, like, what do I want, how can I refine my gifts, or like, what do I do? Like, I keep having these experiences, and people tell me that I'm supposed to be a shaman, or people tell me like I'm supposed to do something with my gifts, but I don't know where to start, but nobody wants to be my teacher. Well, take a Psychic 101 course. You know, that's one way to channel your gifts. I also think that, and a very important thing to note in this conversation, or this conversation that I'm shedding light on, is that you don't have to be a shaman to hone your gifts. You don't have to have an altar. You know, I think people who have an altar have a specific role of healing other people, and healing people using rituals, very specific rituals, very specific ways of accessing spiritual gifts in the spiritual world. That it's very specific. But even if you're having spiritual gifts, doesn't mean you have to have an altar to do all this extra healing stuff. I know for me that that's not in my path. I just know that I just wouldn't be able to have the stamina to do it. But also that I have never been in a situation where I'm supposed to call upon someone to do healing where they realize that I have gifts, right? Or that I can be their student, or that I need a mentor. I really don't think that's in my path, because I think what I'm supposed to do, these spiritual gifts, is just to heal myself, and for myself and my family, right? To heal myself so that I can be present and I can be healthy for my family, and that I know where to hone these gifts so that I'm not in a state of anxiety or stress or depression, but that the things that I'm experiencing are contributing to the healing of myself, and not worrying about like me being this almighty like healer that's supposed to touch everyone, right? That's like there's a name for it, and I kind of feel like it's something like the Messiah syndrome type of thing, where they think like they're a prophet that's supposed to do healing for the masses. I don't think like that's how it works, right? I think that we're intended to have these spiritual gifts to heal ourselves and our family lineage and our ancestral trauma, our generational trauma, by stopping these cycles of trauma that keep taking place, or stopping these toxic cycles, generations moving forward, right? Future generations. I think a lot of us are awakening to our spiritual gifts to be able to heal our family. Because if you think about it, like, there were so many people who were born before you in your family's generation, and thinking about how much trauma they have experienced, that all of that trauma just accumulates, and when it gets down to you, it's like real deep rooted trauma that, you know, somewhere along the line someone has to cut the cord with those traumas so that future generations can thrive and grow too. And so for me, I know that my path is that, to stop those cycles, and that is where I choose to do healing work. And interesting does happen though, that when you start owning up to it, that because all this spiritual knowledge just becomes a part of your rhetoric or part of your vocabulary, that you just start talking about these things with like random people. I found myself, I didn't think I was going to share it, but I found myself doing this with a lot of people who I came across today. It would just go on to the topic of like spirituality, and somehow it would just touch them to where like I can tell like they appreciated it, even though it wasn't my intention to be like, oh, you need this because you're doing this. For example, I was at Lush, right? That bath bomb place. And I had just gotten done doing a session with a client, and I ended up giving this client a rose quartz because she forgot her stress ball, like I was doing her tattoo. And so I gave her rose quartz to hold during the session, and we were talking, we were about to like just wrap up the session, and she was about to go, and she forgot that she still had the rose quartz in her hand, and when she handed it to me, it was really warm. And so if you are into crystals and you're trying to figure out how to feel out crystals, when a crystal warms up really fast in your palm, it's also a really good indicator that that crystal is good for you. It could just be physics or, you know, transference of like heat and energy, but you know, we're talking about energy here too. So if you're channeling energy to the crystal and it's warming up, that means the crystal's warming up for you too, right? So it's working. So I gave that to her. She handed it back. It was really warm. I'm like, you know what? I think she really needs this quartz right now, this rose quartz. So I just kind of gave it to her. And so after that, I decided to go run some errands, and I decided to go to Lush to buy bath bombs for my son. And as I walked in, it was like the last stop. As I walked in, I was greeted by one of the store associates, and they just asked me, you know, whatever they asked me, and they were saying that, oh, what brings you in today? And, you know, I just said, bath bombs, you know, and so there was another customer who heard me and was kind of giggling, and I was just like, oh, you know, that's what are you supposed to say? And so I started having this conversation with the store associate, and they were introducing me to like all these new like bath bombs. They had this really cool Year of the Tiger bath bomb that I was really like, I really wanted to just give for myself, but I'm like, no, you're here to buy something for your son. And so I was looking specifically for bath bombs that had really like colorful effects in the bath. And so we just got to talking about it, and the store associate was also putting the Year of the Tiger bath bombs on display. And so these bath bombs have gold mica, and so they had it all over their hands, and they were telling me that they just were really like enthusiastic about, you know, working there and having glitter or having like mica all over their hands. And so we got to talking, and I asked that about the bath bombs, and so we were just having a conversation about colorful bath bombs, and they showed me all the different types of like cool color bath bomb effects, the bath bombs that had cool color effects. And you know, I just kind of trusted the judgment, and I kind of already knew like what some of them were, but I just kind of went with their recommendation because they were really helpful. And I'm like, oh, you know, I'll take their recommendation for it, because you can't really mess up with bath bombs anyways. And I just really liked that I was having this connection with the store associate to where it was like beyond just like small talk. And so it's so interesting because I think today marks the end of Mercury retrograde. And Mercury retrograde rules over communication and traveling, and so it just was very interesting that, you know, the one day I choose to be social was really one day that I was like social, right? So I go and, you know, I'm picking out all the bath bombs that they recommended to me, and then they were just kind of still talking to me, having this conversation with me, and then they were telling me that it's not really gold. It's actually, it's safe for kids. The mica was safe for kids because a lot of their products had mica in it, and that it was really safe for kids. And so we got to the subject of just talking about mica, right? Synthetic mica. And then I shared with them that, oh, you know, I work with crystals. I really like crystals. And there's actually a crystal called a lepidolite that is mica based, and that it also has lithium in it that helps with anxiety, stress, and it's a very nurturing, soft vibration, and I just love it, right? Like, I'm obsessed with this crystal. And so I kind of saw like a spark in their eye where they were like, oh, you know. And so we had this conversation about crystals, and they weren't too familiar because me being just I wasn't trying to be like the know-it-all, but it seemed like they were struggling with the pronunciation of a certain crystal, and so I just corrected them in a very polite way, and then I shared with them about the lepidolite. I just shared that, it makes sense that you would be working with mica because it's a very soft and nurturing crystal, and it matches you. And so that was also the energy I was getting from this person. And the thing is, like, I wasn't trying to read this person. It's just when you feel someone's energy and you're vibing with it and you're connecting with it, that you just trust it, right? It's the same thing as like when you meet someone and you can tell if they're very standoffish. That's just them protecting their energy, or they're not, like they're completely pouring everything into you, that you are like, okay, I gotta shut my energy off. This person is putting too much of their energy onto me, now I gotta shut it off. So it wasn't anything like that. It was just like natural. Sometimes in these very public spaces that you're bound to experience this with someone. And so I just kind of was like left it at that, and they seemed very, very interested in it. And so as I was ringing up, I was like, okay, Mai Kue, you're done socializing for today. Go home and you'll spend the rest of the day with your son and your husband. And so I go and check out, and they come back up to the register and they give me a free sample of this. They have this really cool, so this is Lush. They have a really cool skin tint with iridescent, like pearly mica. So it's like a highlighter. It kind of looks like a very like speckly highlighter, but it's in a cream. And so they give me a little sample, and I was like, thank you so much. And I was like, I could write down the name of the crystal if you'd like, because I saw that as like, I must have made like an impact on them, and that they're wanting to just follow up and show their appreciation for just me sharing that, because who knows if they needed that, right? Like, who knows what anyone is going through, and maybe just sharing that bit of information helps someone. And so that was really my thing, was like, just trying to brighten up my day and trying not to make it worse for anybody else, and so I saw that, and I just kind of was like, I already know, like, this person, just based on the energy and how we connected, that I tend to have those experiences where people who are searching for something, I come across people like that, and through conversation we just have the same vibration, and that I just share whatever I share intuitively, and that maybe that was the information that they needed, not trying to read into their energy, but that being the intuitive like icebreaker in our conversation, that in a way like it just helped the person. And so I ended up writing the name down, and I talked about lithium being in crystals too, that anything having lithium in it is very healing for people who are anxious, highly anxious, sensitive, or stressed. And I just kind of said it in there because I just found this out about the crystals, that lepidolite helps with grief. And so of all the crystals that I recommend, lepidolite is one of the top ones. So I just wrote it down because I'm like, this is going to be very useful information for this person, and so I might as well just share it with them. And so I wrote it down, and they gave me their name for survey, and then also the person at the register, and they were all just really nice. And so I walked away from it just thinking like, okay, Mai Kue, like, this is one way that you can help spread healing. Not necessarily like a one-on-one, like, hey, I can heal you type of healing, but either just through words and just through your spiritual knowledge. Like, you don't have to be like, I know about this, and I can heal you. It just comes for me naturally, where I just talk about it because it's, again, something that I enjoy talking about on a day-to-day basis, and through my spiritual experiences, like what have I gathered from that, and how I can use it to just share information that's healing. Information can just be healing. And so that's kind of how I've learned to channel my gifts to heal others. And some people might say like, oh, but I'm already doing that. Then okay, if you're already doing it, then like what else is there to complain about in terms of like not getting gifts or not channeling your skills if you're already doing this other part, right? So that's another thing that I wanted to share, is that spiritual healing doesn't necessarily have to look like, a one-on-one like therapy session. It could just be the kindness in your words. It could be the energy exchange, if it is that, or just talking to someone and making someone feel seen. That in itself is healing. And you do that by way of just channeling your spiritual skills, right? I didn't have to use my gift of seeing or gift of hearing or gift of like dreams or whatever to channel that. It was just energy, like feeling their energy, feeling them and what they were trying to gauge and what you were trying to gauge. And one of the easiest ways is just through words, right? Listening to their tones, listening to how they are speaking to you, paying attention to how they are seeing you or viewing you. These all kind of add into that energy exchange. And then not digging for any information too, letting things unfurl intuitively. I think for me too, in channeling spiritual skills or gifts, like you don't want to force it on anyone. You don't want to force information to come out. You don't want to force, someone to tell you that their grandma has passed away and that, you can connect with them, because you never want to do that either. That's just exploiting someone's grief, You want it to all happen intuitively and naturally. That's something that I had to learn and get over too, because then I was thinking like, well, how am I supposed to do healing if nobody like knows that I can do this? And so I know that a lot of even shamans and also psychics and mediums, they struggle with that, is that when they try to prove themselves, that most of the time they also get the wrong answer or they get the wrong response, or they channel the wrong person, or they channel the wrong message. And so I think a key thing too is that if you know that you have these spiritual gifts and you're trying to learn how to refine it, just trusting what you know intuitively. That's been my personal experience anyways. So I feel like there's more that I can contribute if I were having this conversation with someone, but I guess this is kind of the thing with being an introvert and being a hermit. I'm always on hermit mode, FYI. So sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm ready to socialize, but then also like the experience I had today, it's like, okay, now you're done, go home. I guess that's just how it is. But this is pretty much it for this episode. It was a pretty hard episode for me to record because I didn't know what to include. I didn't know what the direction of this episode was going, but I hope that it helped you to answer some of your questions, or it helped you to think about your spiritual experiences or your spiritual gifts or skills in a different way. And for the next episode, I think I might want to talk about the different types of gifts or the different types of skills. I wouldn't say gifts because, well, maybe they are gifts or skills, but I like to refer to them as skills because I feel that everyone has these skills. It's again in a matter of how you fine-tune them to receive clear messages. So thank you so much for tuning in. I will talk to you in the next episode. And that concludes this episode of The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tune in for the next one coming out soon.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel